Tonight's discussion is about inclusion and diversity in the workplace and its potential to boost Jamaica's productivity. Why is diversity and inclusion beneficial? What progress has been made and what obstacles still remain? To discuss, we are joined by Maxine Attong, Gestalt Leadership Specialist, and by Angela Lee, the Managing Director at Knowledge Works Consulting. Thank you very much for joining us, ladies.
Thanks for having us.
So when we talk about diversity and the workplace, what are we talking about?
Angela, you want to take that on?
Yes, diversity and the workplace. So what is diversity? We have found that inside of the workplace, like it has been found, studies globally that really people are marginalized. And the studies have shown that those organizations where you have diversity, like included, women, men, people with disabilities, different gender identities, those workplaces, those companies, organizations that embrace diversity tend to be more productive, more high performing. And although this is something that has been recognized globally, there are still so many areas where it has not been embraced. And why is that?
Is it that somebody is pushing against it, or they just don't happen to have anybody disabled here? I don't know if we have decided not to take anybody disabled. Is it that somebody is pushing against having the widest diversity that we can have?
Well, I could jump in there, Angela.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think most of us, when we look at the people who are closest to us, we would find that more or less those people are like us. If you think about the 5 people who you trust, other than your family members, you would find that they probably share gender, religion, race, ethnicity. They probably speak the same language as you do. And what we call this is our affinity group with an A. And very often we refer to them as our in-group. So naturally you would find that when we transfer this common phenomenon to the organization, that people tend to, especially when they're under stress, they will want to go with those people who they trust. Who do they trust? They trust the people who more or less think like they do, have been to the same schools, grew up more or less with the same status as they did, because that's what the in-group does. So it's a pretty natural phenomenon that we work with. And of course, when we come into organizations, it really doesn't hold well for in-organizations. It also doesn't hold well for communities either.
Right. Yeah. And Maxine, to add to that, there are key factors. How we are socialized and the groups that we're in, we are prone to have certain biases and privileges, and these impact how we approach not only our high-end practices, how we manage teams, how we interact with people.
Yeah.
So,
how do we disrupt?
Yes.
How do we disrupt that? Because if we're comfortable, we're happy, we're pleased with our results, what's the benefit in changing? What's the benefit in making it more diverse?
So I think the distinction is who is pleased, right? So who is pleased? Because for everybody who is included, a number of people are excluded. So for instance, in the Caribbean, our UWE graduates, more than 60% are female. Yet when you look at boards, there's less than 2% of chairpersons who are female on boards. And when you look at board members, less than 15% of board members are female. So going back to your question, who is it okay for? When we look at the plight of people with disabilities in the Caribbean, are these people gainfully employed? So again, back to your question, who does it work for? There's small amounts of people who it actually works for, and those are the people who have probably been, their parents, their grandparents have probably paved the way for them. and it excludes a whole lot of us, and I'm female, it excludes a lot of females.
All right. Maxine, Attong, and Angela Lee will pick up the discussion right after this break. Stay with us.
And we welcome you back to continue our examination of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Still with us, Maxine Attong, Digital Leadership Specialist, and Angela Lee, Managing Director at Knowledge Works Consulting. Ladies, prior to the break, the issue of gender came up. And I can't help but think back to my very much younger days when I worked in finance. And it was a matter of culture and lifestyle in that at the beginning, I came in with a group of people who were pretty much even between male and female. By the end of it, I dare say at least 70 to 80% of the women had left due to the rather grinding nature of the culture and of the lifestyle within finance as a general rule, particularly in New York. To address the issue of diversity and inclusion, would we not also have to change certain corporate cultures to ensure that it is welcoming to all?
I think yes. I want to say yes to that, and I want to add a caveat. So yes, we need to have cultures that are inclusive to all, and everybody needs to find a sense of belonging. So all those engagement surveys that people do, it's really about testing how do we feel about the organization, how do we feel in terms of our sense of belonging. And the sense of belonging is a human need, it's an intrinsic need. And therefore, because we spend so much time in organizations, of course, organizations are concerned about belonging. Having said that, and having worked in finance myself, I am a certified management accountant, and working in that field, there are a number of things that may make women leave. Not the work, not the long hours, the misogyny that is rampant in that sector. There is a lot of sexism that I have been subjected to as an accountant, and there really isn't a place to blow the whistle, at least here in the Caribbean, to raise your hand and say, this is a problem. We all know that when women have children, they are torn because, of course, society says a good mother should be X, Y, and Z, and if you want to pursue a career, it means that you can't stay and work long hours as your male counterparts. So, and that's what the caveat is, because that is a layered statement, and we have to remove the layers to understand why exactly the young ladies would have left and left most of the males thereafter.
Ms. Lee, I'd like to piggyback on that. And what I'd like to ask you is this. If that culture works for, say, a particular company, and they're a Fortune 500 bank or a hedge fund, and you come in as a 24-year-old and you're making 100,000 US, why should they change it? And what gets improved by cutting hours or cutting the very hard-going nature of certain industries such as finance? Is it worth going after having an additional woman at the table?
Well, the bottom line answers the questions. So companies that have a more diverse workforce and a more diverse executive team, i.e. the inclusion of women, the inclusion of people of color, and this, I guess, would be in places like North America, they have shown that their profits increased by over 30%. So there is no argument that those are the stats. So the question is, do we want to stay where we are making $100,000 a year, or do we want to push for diversity and make $130,000 a year?
So what is it about this diversity that causes this sort of improved performance?
It is because, you know,
there's the inclusivity, Maxine, okay, like you said, and the sense of belonging that you're heard. And you find when people have that sense of belonging and inclusivity, then they thrive, they bring their authentic self to the table.
And to add to that, Angela, the ability to have a multiple reality perspective. So if all of us are of the same background, we look at a problem the same way. When Angela and I look at a problem together, she looks at it from a Jamaican lens, I look at it from a Trinidadian lens, the lens in terms of her community, I look at it in terms of my community, which means that when we look at a problem, we have a richer discussion and a bigger discussion. Think of it in terms of sales. Think of it in terms of having diverse people around the table selling the same product. their communities are going to be different. They're going to pitch ideas which are going to be different from a group that is the same. So the argument sort of proves itself because it just says, the question is, how far can we go now that we are embracing different cultures?
Thank you. Ms. Lee, I'd like to ask you, when it comes to this issue in general, is this more of a socioeconomic thing? Because is this a question that's being asked by, say, the man on the street who works as the gardener, the day laborer, the security guard, or is this more of a middle to upper middle class concern within industries outside of day laborers, if you will?
No, I would say it goes across the board. Of course, you have the classism, you have sexism. I mean, you have people with different disabilities who are not accepted. And then, of course, there is a man on the street who, say, in Jamaica, who lives in one of the not so favorable communities, who a hiring manager is going to think differently about hiring that person. And so they're going to give a different address to be able to be eligible. So it goes across the board. So I would not say it is restricted to a lower class person.
But what about the measures that have been taken to encourage diversity? We have the Disabilities Act, which is supposed to help people who are disabled. Has it made a difference?
I do believe we are starting to make some inroads, and we cannot discount that. More and more companies, diversity is being included at the table on a corporate level, and so we have started looking at it, and I think we have some ways to go, and it really takes for the company for it to be coming from a corporate level. So the company needs to embrace.
Well, I want to ask you about that. Should it be legislated, or should it just be companies being enlightened and realizing that this affects the bottom line and making it a part of the new culture?
I think in terms of women, we have a lot of examples to follow for women to be on board. There are countries around the world, Israel, Pakistan, Australia, that have mandated, especially for state organizations, that there must be at least one female on a board, and as well as for publicly listed companies. So in some countries around the world, not the US, not in the Caribbean.
Well, Jamaica has 30%, at least 30% of either gender.
That's great for publicly traded companies. That's excellent. So quotas work because it's a sort of affirmative action.
Like, Ms. Lee, to say the issue of gender and women, the numbers here say that Jamaican women's income estimated to be 38% lower than men's. Jamaica is currently ranked 35th out of 144 countries in terms of gender parity, economic participation, opportunity. In addition to that, we also have what is generally known as the second shift, the unpaid time women spend as the primary caregiver to children, to elderly parents, and running the household. With all of this, where do we go in order to make it more equitable and to make better use on a economic side and on a developmental side to move the forward and our economy forward?
I'm not hearing what you just said. I lost you.
Well, what do we need to do to ensure that women become more of an active and productive part of society, of the economy, with all the hindrances that seem to be on them? Did you hear me?
Angela, I know you said something about the second shift.
Yes.
You spoke about women in the second shift. We just lost a bit of your audio.
Yes.
How do we get women to be more a part of the economy, even with all the hindrances that are laid out in front of them?
Okay.
Who's taking that, Angela or Maxine?
So a piece of the work that I do is because at the end of the day, nobody's coming to save us, right?
Yes.
And a piece of the work that I do around women is to remind them of their power. Because since we are little girls, we were told how to behave, don't behave a certain way. There's a whole conversation about being a lady, being a woman. And of course, when you enter the workplace, you do have a lot of other issues that you face. And so just think of an onion with many, many layers wrapped around it. And a lot of times the work that I do with women is helping them unwrap to return and find their purest self so that they could reclaim their power. I don't believe that anybody needs to empower women. We probably need to remind them of their power. They can reclaim their power and begin to set boundaries, set their own personal visions, so that when these outside, I want to say, attacks come, that we don't really have to kowtow to them, that we can stand in our power and navigate the world differently from how we were told to navigate it or how we expected to navigate it.
Right. Now, Ms. Lee, I'd really like to break that part down. Could you explain to us, because I'm looking at it right here, occupational segregation, and it seems to be a thing, especially with women, with people getting shuffled one way or another within corporate tracks particularly. What is it from your standpoint, and how do we address it realistically?
Is that for me or Angela?
For Ms. Lee.
Did you hear the question?
Yes. He said, in terms of how do we stop women being shuffled around in the corporate? I think that's the question.
Yeah,
that's
it's talking about segregation.
Occupational segregation.
Occupational segregation. What is that? It sounds very important and interesting, but how do we deal with it? And who is affected by it? Is it only women?
I am not familiar with that term. You can say that for sure. Are you familiar with that term,
Yeah.
Angela?
I've heard that too.
Okay,
but then next question.
Okay, let's. We only have a few minutes left, so we want to talk about solutions now. How do we really get to becoming diverse in our workspaces? We only have 30 seconds. Can we take that, Angela? How do we start to fix this problem?
Okay, I think first we get to sharpen up our awareness of what diversity really is, why it matters, and really be courageous in taking the conversation to the table. And we get to look at the biases that are inherent and how do we manage and interrupt those biases, and really organizations embrace really cultivating that inclusive environment where everybody feels valued, respected, and it starts at the top.
Yes. Okay, Maxine, Attong, and Angela Lee, thank you so much for joining us on our panel discussion this evening. When we come back, we'll have lifestyle and entertainment.